All right, let's go. Number 10. Titanoboa, the serpent that ruled a drowned world. In 2004, a field crew was working the Torrejon coal mine in the La Guajira Desert of northern Colombia, one of the largest open-pit mines on the planet, prospecting the gray rock for fossil leaves and the shells of ancient turtles. They turned up a single vertebra. It was so oversized that when the bone reached the laboratory, it was first cataloged as the remains of a giant crocodile. A snake specialist named Jason Head, then at the University of Toronto, examined it and saw the error at once. It was one joint from the spine of a snake, and the snake it came from was built on the scale of a nightmare. The excavation co-organized by Carlos Jaramillo of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute and Jonathan Block of the Florida Museum of Natural History eventually yielded bones from 28 separate animals, more than 180 fragments in all. In 2009, Head and his colleagues published the analysis in the journal Nature. By measuring those vertebrae against the proportions of living boas and anacondas, they reconstructed a body close to 13 meters long, roughly 42 feet, with an estimated mass above 1,100 kilograms. They named it Titanoboa cerejonensis. It lived between 58 and 60 million years ago in the wet heat that settled over the tropics after the asteroid that ended the age of dinosaurs. No larger snake has ever been found, and nothing else has come close. The skull surfaced only later, and it was the rarest prize of all because snake skulls are fragile and almost never survive. When it did appear, it confirmed the animal as a true constrictor, a relative of the boas, a hunter, that killed by coiling and crushing rather than by poison. It did not so much share its swamp with rivals as with provisions. The same beds gave up Carbonomes, a freshwater turtle, with a shell large enough for a grown man to sit inside and the bones of oversized crocodile relatives. To Titanoboa, the largest predators of that drowned world were simply the larger items on the menu. Imagine a body as long as a city bus and as heavy as a small rhinoceros. A serpent as thick through the middle as a grown adult is tall. But here is where a record-breaking animal turns into something far stranger than a number on a chart. The size of a cold-blooded creature is never accidental. A snake this large could only have functioned in a world far hotter than our own. Head and his co-authors argued that to drive a body of that mass, the mean temperature at the equator had to have sat between 30 and 34 degrees Celsius, several degrees above the warmest rainforest that exists today. A number of climate scientists pushed back hard on that figure, and the dispute has never fully resolved. Yet the underlying logic is difficult to escape. A giant cold-blooded animal is a kind of instrument, and its bones preserve the reading of a vanished hothouse Earth. The forests it moved through have not entirely disappeared either. The same serrajon rock that held the snake also preserved the oldest known rainforest in the Americas, the deep ancestor of the modern Amazon. The furnace that built this monster, the wet equatorial engine that turns heat and time into giants, is still running today. And we are at this very moment in the slow process of feeding it again. We prefer to think of monsters as safely sealed behind 60 million years of stone. Titanoboa was not a freak of nature. It was simply what the tropics produce, when the planet runs hot enough to permit it. The deep past holds more than one such warm chapter, and every time the world has heated, life has answered by raising something larger than what came before. Number 9. The terror birds, when the ruling predator wore feathers. In the early 1960s, two amateur fossil hunters named Benjamin Waller and Robert Allen were diving the dark bed of the Santa Fe River in Florida, recovering the bones of extinct animals from the silt when they brought up a strange and oversized leg bone. It belonged to no mammal. In 1963, the ornithologist Pierce Broadcorb examined it and recognized that North America had once been home to something almost nobody had suspected: a flightless predatory bird tall enough to look a grown man in the eye. He named it Titanis walleri, in Waller's honor. The fossils were fragmentary, a piece of the lower leg, and a toe, but they came from one of the largest birds the continent has ever known. Titanus belonged to a family the scientific literature calls the Phorusrhacidae, and which everyone else calls the terror birds. They first evolved in South America roughly 60 million years ago, during the long stretch when that continent drifted alone as an island, and for tens of millions of years, in the absence of any large mammalian carnivore, they reigned over it unchallenged. Into that vacancy, the birds grew enormous. The family was first recognized in 1887 when the Argentine naturalist Florentino Ameghino described a massive lower jaw, and at first mistook it for the remains of a giant mammal. The truth turned out to be stranger than his error. The largest of these birds, Killington guillermoi, described from a skull unearthed in Patagonia in 2006, carried a head more than 70 centimeters long, the biggest bird skull ever recovered, ending in a hooked beak shaped like an axe. The animal stood close to 3 meters tall, and some of its cousins, like the heavyset Brontornis, may have carried even more bulk. Their nearest living relatives are the Seriema's slender South American birds the size of a chicken. Picture a predator, the height of a horse, sprinting on 2 legs at speeds approaching 50 kilometers an hour, killing prey by driving a beak the length of your forearm down through bone. Here is where the comfortable version of the story falls apart. Work on how these birds fed, led by Federico de Grange, and the anatomist Lawrence Whitmer in a 2010 study, found that the terror bird's skull was rigid and unyielding, built for one brutal technique, striking downward like a pickaxe again and again, rather than thrashing prey from side to side as a crocodile or a dog would. And for most of their reign, the terror birds were confined to South America. Then, a few million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama rose from the sea and fused the 2 American continents into one. Animals poured across the new bridge in both directions in the great exchange that reshaped the hemisphere, and Titanus walked north into Texas and Florida, carrying the terror into a land that had never seen its equal. Then they vanished, and not at our hands. Improved dating of the Titanus fossils places the last of the great terror birds more than 1 million years before the first human being ever set foot in the Americas. We never met them. We never competed with them, never feared them, never recorded them in a single story. An entire dynasty of apex predators, 60 million years deep, rose and fell, and left no trace whatsoever in human memory. That absence is the part worth sitting with. Not that such a creature existed, but that it dominated for an unimaginable span of time and disappeared completely before our species was even possible. The world has been full of monsters for almost the whole of its history. We arrived late after the most terrible of them had already left the stage, and the silence they left behind is one we have only recently learned to read. Number 8. Andrewsarchus, the largest meat eater we cannot describe. In the spring of 1923, a Chinese field assistant named Con Chuan Pao, working on the 3rd of the legendary Central Asiatic expeditions, led by the explorer Roy Chapman Andrews, was searching the eroding badlands of the Gobi Desert in what is now Inner Mongolia. There, in rock laid down some 45 million years ago, he uncovered a skull. It was a single skull, and nothing more but its size stopped the entire camp. The American Museum of Natural History shipped it back to New York, where the great paleontologist Henry Fairfield Osborn described it in 1924 and gave it a name honoring the expedition's leader, Andrewsarchus mongoliensis. The skull measures roughly 83 centimeters in length and 56 across. That is the largest skull known from any meat-eating land mammal, larger than that of any bear, any great cat, any predator that has ever hunted on 4 legs. It is armed with a battery of heavy, blunt, crushing teeth, the kind built to shatter bone. Even within the expedition, there was disagreement about what they had found. The lead paleontologist, Walter Granger, suspected the skull belonged to a member of an extinct group of giant pigs. Osborn looked at the same bone and declared the animal the largest land carnivore ever discovered, and for a century, the title has more or less held. By comparison, the skull is nearly twice the length of a large brown bear's, and roughly triple the length of a wolf's. But this is where conventional paleontology meets a wall it has never climbed over, and the honest answer is that it has simply stopped at the foot of it. We have the skull. We have almost nothing else. No complete skeleton of Andrewsarchus has ever been found. Every reconstruction you have seen, every museum painting of a colossal wolf-like beast, or a hooved horror the size of a small rhino, is an educated guess built outward from one head. We do not actually know how long its body was. We do not know how it carried its weight, whether it ran or ambushed or scavenged. Reconstructions of the animal have swelled and shrunk with each generation of scientists, drifting between a rhinoceros-sized killer and something altogether leaner. For decades, it sat confidently filed among the giant predatory mammals. More recent analysis suggests something odder still, a relative not of wolves, but of pigs and hippos, a cousin of the same lineage that returned to the sea and became the whales. Whether it killed its own food or merely crushed the carcasses of the already dead remains genuinely open. This is the quiet, unsettling truth at the center of so much of deep history. We name these creatures, we mount them in museums, we feel that we know them. Then you look closely and realize that one of the largest carnivorous mammals ever to walk the earth is known to us from a single fragment of bone, and that almost everything we believe about it is reconstruction painted over a void. The skull emerged from the Erdene manha beds of the Gobi ground that has since yielded some of the richest fossil hauls ever found. Yet in a full century of further digging across those deserts, no second Andrewsarchus has ever surfaced. It belongs to a branch of the mammal tree that also produced the entelodonts, the so-called hell pigs beasts, with their own monstrous skulls and bone-crushing jaws, which tells us roughly what company it kept, and almost nothing about how it actually lived. It crushed something in those jaws 45 million years ago, in a desert that was then a forest. We will probably never learn what. The most we can say is that the head was real, the teeth were real, and the rest is a shape we have drawn in the dark and agreed to believe. Number 7. Thylacoleo, the lion that was not a lion. In May of 2002, a group of cavers exploring a remote sinkhole on the Nullarbor Plain in Western Australia lowered themselves into a chamber that had been sealed for tens of thousands of years. On the floor, almost perfectly preserved, lay the skeletons of an animal that science had only ever glimpsed in fragments, one nearly complete with a dozen others scattered through the dark. For the first time, researchers could study the whole creature. What they found was a predator unlike anything alive on the planet today. The site is now known plainly as the Thylacoleo Caves. The animal is Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, first named from scraps by the British anatomist Richard Owen in 1859. Despite the name, it was no relative of any cat. It was a marsupial, a cousin of the wombat and the kangaroo that had evolved into a flesh-eater of terrible efficiency. It weighed between roughly 100 and 130 kilograms, the size of a leopard, but built heavier, and it carried an enormous, semi-opposable thumb tipped with a hooked, retractable claw. Its killing apparatus was like nothing in the cat family. The long canines a lion depends on were reduced almost to nothing, and in their place sat a pair of enlarged, forward-jutting incisors for stabbing with a long blade-like premolar running down each jaw that worked like a bolt cutter, shearing through hide and muscle and bone in a single closing of the mouth. In 2005, the paleontologist Stephen Rowe and his colleagues published a comparative study of bite force in the journal Proceedings of the Royal Society B. They measured the bite of every great mammalian predator they could. Thylacoleo came out on top. Pound for pound, it had the most powerful bite of any mammal living or extinct that has ever been tested. Decades of patient excavation at the Naracoorte Caves in South Australia, much of it led by the paleontologist Rod Wells, had already shown what those jaws could do to a carcass, leaving deep V-shaped gouges in the limb bones of giant kangaroos, and, on Diprotodon, the rhino-sized marsupial that was the largest the world has ever produced. A leopard-sized animal that could bite down harder than a male African lion, hold its prey with a clawed thumb like a meat hook, and open a body with a single stroke. And here is where the discovery becomes genuinely disturbing because of when this creature died. Thylacoleo did not vanish in some unreachable geological age. It was still hunting across Australia as recently as 40,000 years ago, long after the first people reached the continent. The earliest Aboriginal Australians did not read about this predator in a book. They shared the land with it. And on rock walls in the Kimberley region of the Northwest, there is ancient art that several researchers interpret as a portrait of a striped, stub-tailed marsupial hunter, a face that may be the only eyewitness image of Thylacoleo in existence, painted by someone who had actually seen one. Consider what that requires. Human beings reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago, and the marsupial lion endured for many thousands of years beyond that. There was time across hundreds of generations for the animal to pass from a living danger into a memory, and for the memory to harden into ochre on stone. The anatomy hints at an ambush hunter that climbed into trees and dropped onto whatever passed beneath, and our ancestors would have learned to watch not only the grass and the water, but the branches overhead. A predator with the strongest bite of any mammal, with a killing claw on a grasping hand, lived alongside people whose descendants walk that same country today. We did not inherit a world swept clean of monsters. We walked into one that still had a hunter waiting above us, and for a long while we lived beneath it. The caves on the Nullarbor still hold the claw marks of animals that climbed down into the blackness and never climbed back out. Some of those marks were left by Thylacoleo itself. We are simply the most recent creatures to lower ourselves into that dark, and the only ones who came back up to describe it. Number 6. Megalania, the dragon that may have outlived its own extinction. In 1859, the same year, and the same anatomist who named the marsupial lion Richard Owen examined a set of fossilized vertebrae shipped to England from the Darling Downs of Queensland, Australia. They came from a lizard, but the proportions were monstrous, suggesting a monitor lizard, a goanna scaled up to a size that should not have been possible. Owen named it Megalania prisca, which translates roughly as the great ancient roamer. Modern science files it within the genus Varanus, the same group that holds today's monitor lizards and the Komodo dragon. It was the largest lizard ever to live on land. Pinning down its full size has been difficult, because complete skeletons are rare. Early reconstructions ran to 7 meters or beyond. More cautious recent estimates from researchers, such as the Australian paleontologist Ralph Molnar, settle nearer 4.5 to 5.5 meters, with a weight that may still have reached several hundred kilograms. In 2009, the venom researcher Brian Fry, then at the University of Melbourne, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, demonstrating that monitor lizards, including the Komodo dragon, are genuinely venomous, and that their giant extinct cousin almost certainly was as well. His paper concluded that Megalania was in all likelihood the largest venomous animal that has ever existed. Its nearest living relative offers a glimpse of what that meant. The Komodo dragon, a far smaller cousin clinging to a handful of Indonesian islands, can pull down a water buffalo, opening a wound and leaving the animal to weaken and collapse over the following days. Megalania was several times its size, and the Pleistocene world it hunted was stocked with prey to match the rhino-sized Diprotodon giant kangaroos and large flightless birds, all of it within reach of a reptile that needed only to land a single envenomed bite and wait. A predatory lizard, longer than a car, delivering a bite that did not merely tear, but poison, dropping blood pressure and thinning the blood until its prey bled out where it stood. What makes Megalania so unsettling is that it may never have fully left. The animal did not die out in the deep past. It endured until roughly 50,000 years ago, deep into the window when the first people were spreading across Australia. Why it died is the same fierce argument that surrounds every one of the continent's lost giants. A tangle of shifting climate, human fire, and hunting that researchers have never fully untied. And unlike most vanished megafauna, Megalania has never entirely receded into the past. Across the more remote stretches of the Australian interior and the rainforests of the north, there is a long and stubborn tradition of sightings accounts of enormous unidentified goannas far larger than any living species reported by ranchers, soldiers, and bushmen over more than a century. The Australian researcher Rex Gilroy has collected these reports for decades. Mainstream science is correctly skeptical. There is no carcass, no bone, no photograph that has survived scrutiny, and an animal that size would demand a sizable breeding population and a great deal of food to persist unseen on a settled continent. The reports are almost certainly misidentified parentes themselves, impressively large lizards or exaggerations born of fear and bad light. The probability that Megalania still lives is very low, and an honest account has to say so. And yet, the unease does not fully dissolve because the animal vanished so recently in geological terms only yesterday, and because the Australian outback remains one of the least surveyed landscapes on the planet, a place where living reptile species are still being named. As recently as the past few decades, herpetologists have described monitor lizards new to science from northern Australia and New Guinea, a reminder of how little of that world has ever truly been catalogued. We know with certainty that for thousands of years, human beings shared this continent with a venomous lizard the size of a saltwater crocodile. What we cannot say with the same certainty is the precise moment the last one died. Every few years, another report surfaces and is logged and quietly fades, and the bone that would settle the matter never comes. Somewhere out in the red interior, that question is still lying in the dust, waiting for someone to turn it over. Number 5. The giant ground sloth, and the monster the Amazon refuses to surrender. In 1895, a German pioneer named Hermann Eberhard, exploring the cold edge of Patagonia in southern Chile, entered a vast cave on the flank of a mountain. Hanging there in the dry and frigid dark, he found a large piece of skin. It was tough, studded from within, with small lumps of bone, and it looked disturbingly fresh, as though peeled from an animal that had died only recently. It had not. The skin belonged to a Mylodon, a ground sloth, and it would later be dated to somewhere between 10 and 13,000 years old, preserved almost perfectly by the still freezing air of the cave that now carries the animal's name. The ground sloths were among the strangest giants the Americas ever produced. The largest of them, Megatherium, whose bones were first unearthed near Buenos Aires in 1788 and described by the French anatomist Georges Cuvier in 1796, stood taller than an elephant and may have weighed several tons. It was a plant eater, but a plant eater built like a siege engine with claws like scythes and the strength to haul whole trees to the ground. Mylodon, the one from the cave, was smaller the size of an ox, its hide armored from beneath with thousands of tiny embedded bones that scientists call dermal ossicles, a layer of natural chainmail grown into the skin. It also carries Darwin's name. As a young man aboard the Beagle in the 1830s, Charles Darwin himself dug fossil ground sloth bones from the cliffs of Argentina. Specimens later studied by Richard Owen and the species Mylodon. Darwinii honors him, still a reminder that these armored giants stood at the very birth of our understanding of extinction itself. A plant eater the size of a modern bull, wrapped in living armor, with claws long enough to disembowel anything reckless enough to attack it. But here, the established account begins to fray, because the ground sloths may not be entirely gone. In the 1990s, an American biologist named David Oren, then director of research at the Gobi Museum in Belém, at the mouth of the Amazon, began collecting accounts from deep in the Brazilian rainforest of a creature the indigenous people call the mapinguari, a huge, foul-smelling, slow-moving beast, covered in reddish hair that walks upright and is said to be impossible to kill with ordinary weapons because bullets simply glance off its hide. Oren interviewed more than 100 eyewitnesses, often holding up replica models to refine their descriptions. In a 1993 paper, he laid out a careful case that nearly every feature attributed to the mapinguari matched point for point the anatomy of a surviving melodontid ground sloth. The reddish hair matched the preserved fur. The legendary bulletproof skin matched the dermal ossicles. The reports of an animal rearing onto two legs matched a sloth standing to feed. He pointed to harder traces too, among them the ground sloth's distinctive hyoid, the bone that anchors the machinery of the voice, which he argued could account for the strange, throat-deep cries the witnesses kept describing. The scientific establishment treats the Mapinguari as folklore, and that judgment is reasonable. No body has ever been produced, no bone, no scrap of armored skin taken from a living animal. Yet the case resists easy dismissal. We know that ground sloths survived on Caribbean islands until roughly 4,200 years ago, more recently than the building of the pyramids. We know the Amazon basin remains the largest and least explored forest on Earth. And there is a stranger footnote at the very edge of the historical record. In the 1880s, the explorer Ramon Lista, who would later govern the Argentine province of Santa Cruz, reported watching a shaggy, red-haired beast cross his path in the Patagonian scrub, firing his rifle at it, and seeing the bullets seem to bounce from its hide before it vanished into the brush. Whatever the Mapinguari is, the legend did not appear from nothing. It is the shape of a real creature, pressed into the oral history of a people who once watched the last of the giants withdraw into the trees. The truly disquieting possibility is not that the sloth survives. It is that the memory does held perfectly intact across thousands of years, like a sheet of skin in a cold cave, waiting for us to recognize what we are looking at. Number 4. Haast's eagle, the bird that hunted from the sky and may have hunted us. In 1871, the geologist Julius von Haast, working in New Zealand, received a collection of large bones recovered from a drained swamp on the Glenmark estate in Canterbury Land, owned by a settler named George Henry Moore. The bones belonged to an eagle, but the dimensions were impossible for any eagle anyone knew. Von Haast named the creature in Moore's honor. We now call it Haast's eagle, Hieratus moorii, and it was the heaviest eagle the fossil record contains. The figures are difficult to absorb. Females weighed between 10 and 15 kilograms, with some estimates running higher against a wingspan of around 3 meters. Its rear talon alone reached the length of a tiger's claw, and as the biologist Michael Bunce and his colleagues described in a 2005 study in the journal PLOS Biology, those talons could pierce and crush bone through 50 millimeters of flesh. Before human beings arrived, New Zealand had almost no land mammals at all. The islands belonged to the birds, and the largest of them were the moa flightless giants, some of which stood taller than a man and weighed up to 200 kilograms. Haast's eagle was the single predator capable of killing them. The strike marks preserved on moa pelvises record how it did so. It would seize the bird's hindquarters in one set of talons and drive the other foot through the skull or neck in a single blow. A bird of prey heavy enough to knock a person off their feet, killing animals 15 times its own weight by shattering their bones in midair. Here is where the find turns darker because of what the DNA gave up. Bunce's genetic work revealed that this monstrous predator had evolved with astonishing speed from one of the smallest eagles alive, a little eagle that weighs under a kilogram, an animal roughly 1/10 its mass. The clock in the genes suggested the whole transformation had taken less than 2 million years. Perhaps far less an explosion of size, so rapid that the paleontologists Paul Schofield and Ken Ashwell would later argue the bird's brain had struggled to keep pace, lagging behind the rest of the body as it swelled into a giant. This is island gigantism, at its most extreme on a landmass stocked with enormous prey and emptied of mammalian competition. A small bird had ballooned to 10 or 15 times its ancestral mass. Evolution had built a monster, and it had done so quickly, which tells us it can do so again. And then there is the question that science approaches with caution, and Maori tradition does not flinch from it all. The eagle survived until roughly 600 years ago. It was still flying when the first Polynesian settlers reached New Zealand, and its fate was bound to theirs. Within perhaps a century and a half of human arrival, every species of moa had been hunted into extinction, and an eagle built to kill the largest birds on Earth was left with nothing to hunt. It followed its prey into oblivion. Bunce and his colleagues note that there is no direct physical evidence that humans were ever its target, but Maori oral history brims with the puakai and the tehokioi, an enormous bird of the mountains that swept down and carried off people and children above all. And there are rock drawings in the South Island that may preserve the image of it. In some tellings, the bird grew so bold that it became a menace to whole settlements until a band of men contrived to trap and destroy it, a story that reads less like invention than like the memory of a real danger that was finally answered. The early settlers shared their valleys with a raptor that killed 200-kilogram moa for a living. To that bird, a human being was not an unthinkable target. It was merely a small one. We extinguished Haast's eagle within a few centuries of meeting it by hunting its prey to nothing and burning its forests to the ground. The heaviest eagle the world has ever made did not die in some distant prehistoric collapse. It died because we arrived. For a few hundred years, our ancestors lived beneath a sky that held something able to see them as food, and they looked up and they were afraid, and they were right to be. Number 3, the short-faced bear, the gatekeeper at the door of a new world. In 1854, the Philadelphia anatomist Joseph Leidy, the founding figure of American vertebrate paleontology, examined a fragment of jawbone pulled from a cave deposit and recognized that it belonged to a kind of bear that no longer existed. He named the genus Arctodus. The fuller picture that emerged over the following century is one of the most physically imposing land predators North America has ever held, the giant short-faced bear Arctodus simus, which haunted the Ice Age from Alaska to Mexico and only vanished around 11,000 years ago. It was enormous, and it was built wrong in a way that made it more frightening rather than less. The largest males may have weighed close to a ton, rivaling the biggest polar bears alive today. But unlike the heavy compact frame of a modern grizzly, Arctodus stood on long, slender legs, and when it reared onto its hind feet, it could lift its head well past 3.5 meters high enough to look down through a second-story window. Its muzzle was short and broad, giving it the blunt, almost feline face that lends the species its name and a powerful bite. For years, researchers including the wildlife biologist Valerius Geist read that long-legged build as the mark of a fearsome and far-ranging hunter, an animal fast enough to run prey down across open ground. Later, studies of the chemistry locked in its bones, led by scientists such as Paul Mathias, complicated the portrait. The isotopes showed an animal that consumed enormous quantities of meat, but they could not say whether it killed that meat or stole it. And some now read those long legs not as a sprinter's weapons, but as the build of a tireless wanderer, covering vast distances to find carcasses and using its sheer size to drive other predators off their kills. The debate is real and unresolved, but scavenger or hunter for anything that met it, the encounter was the same. A bear that could meet an adult human eye to eye while standing on all fours and tower 3 meters above them when it chose to stand. But here is where the discovery reaches forward and presses against us directly. Arctodus survived to the very end of the last ice age. It was already there, already established, when the first human beings crossed from Asia into the Americas and began their long walk south into an empty continent. That walk ran either through a narrow, ice-free corridor between two vast continental glaciers or down a Pacific coastline thick with life, and either way, it led straight through the range of the largest carnivore the continent possessed. Some researchers have argued that this bear may be one reason the journey was so slow and so deadly. A living gate standing between the first Americans and the rich, untouched land beyond. Whatever the truth of that, the meeting itself is not in question. Picture a small band of people carrying fire and stone-tipped spears walking into a valley where a 1-ton bear is already feeding and having to decide in that instant whether to fight for the meat or run. Some of those bands turned back. Some did not. The archaeological record of those first centuries is thin and fiercely contested, but the timing itself is not in dispute. People and short-faced bear stood on the same ground in the same years, and only one of them is still here. This is the part that should keep you awake. The peopling of the Americas, the event that made possible every nation, every language, every culture of two entire continents, did not unfold in a gentle and welcoming wilderness. It unfolded in a land patrolled by a predator that could outweigh a horse and stand taller than a doorway. Every step our ancestors took into that new world was taken in the knowledge that something far larger than them might already be there waiting in the next valley. They walked in regardless, not once, but in wave after wave, generation after generation, until that new world was theirs. That is the quiet, almost unbearable fact at the root of the human story in the Americas. The door to the new world had a guardian and our ancestors carrying nothing but sharpened stone, and their own nerve opened it anyway. Number 2. The saber-toothed cat, the icon of a world we watched die. On the western edge of Los Angeles, beneath one of the densest cities on the planet, there is a place where the ground bleeds asphalt. The Rancho La Brea tar pits have been seeping crude oil to the surface for tens of thousands of years, and for all that time, the sticky black pools hidden under dust and standing water have trapped animals that wandered too close. When systematic excavation began in earnest in the early 20th century, the scale of the death assemblage stunned the scientists working the pits. They pulled out the remains of more than 2,000 individual saber-toothed cats. Not scattered fragments, thousands of animals layered in the tar, a graveyard of one of the most famous predators that has ever lived. And the saber-tooths were not even the most common hunter in the asphalt. That distinction belonged to the dire wolf, whose remains at La Brea run into the thousands more. Two great predators that ruled the same vanished world and died in the same black pools, side by side, century after century. The cat is Mylodon, and the species at La Brea is Mylodon fatalis. It was heavier than a modern lion, a muscular ambush hunter reaching up to 280 kilograms with forelimbs built to wrestle large prey to the ground. Its defining weapons were the canine's curved blades of enamel and dentine that grew to nearly 18 centimeters, and in its even larger South American cousin, Smilodon populator longer still. Those teeth were too fragile to bite into struggling bony prey. The cat had to pin its victim beneath its enormous arms, hold it still, and then deliver a single deep, precise bite to the soft throat. It killed slowly, deliberately, at close quarters. Many of the La Brea skeletons carry old injuries that had healed over shattered bones and ruined hips that should have meant slow starvation for a solitary animal, which has led some researchers to argue that Smilodon lived and hunted in groups, and that the maimed and the broken were fed and tolerated by their own kind. A cat the size of a large bear carrying daggers in its jaws, longer than a human hand, that held its prey down and waited. But here is where the past collides with the present, and the story becomes about us. Smilodon was still alive at the close of the Ice Age, roughly 10 to 13,000 years ago, which means the first peoples of the Americas hunted the same megafauna, crossed the same valleys, and shared the same firelit nights with the saber-toothed cat. They knew it. They saw its eyes at the edge of the light. Then, within a few thousand years of human arrival, Smilodon and nearly all of its giant contemporaries were gone in an extinction so sudden and so complete that scientists still argue over how much of it we caused. And now, for the first time in the history of life, that finality is no longer certain. In April of 2025, the company Colossal Biosciences announced that it had produced 3 living animals named Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi, which it called dire wolves, the great pack hunter that died beside Smilodon in those same tar pits. The animals were made by reading the genetic blueprint from a 13,000-year-old tooth and a 72,000-year-old skull, then editing the genome of a modern gray wolf to match. The company, founded by the entrepreneur Ben Lamb and the Harvard geneticist George Church, with the ancient DNA specialist Beth Shapiro as its chief scientist, presented the births as proof that extinction need not be permanent. Many researchers object, pointing out that a gray wolf carrying 20 engineered edits is not the vanished species, but an approximation wearing its face. The animals will live out their days on a guarded preserve behind tall fences watched by drones and cameras never released into a world that no longer holds a place for them. Which raises a quieter question than whether they are truly dire wolves, whether even if we can rebuild a monster, there is anywhere left for it to belong. That is the strange new weight our own generation carries. For 10,000 years, the death of the Ice Age giants was the one thing about them that could not be undone. Their absence was a wound in the world one we had inflicted and would simply have to live beside. We are the first humans with reason to wonder whether that is still true, and the first who have had to ask whether bringing the monsters back is an act of repair or a mistake we have not yet learned to see. Number 1. Gigantopithecus, the monster that may still be walking through our dreams. In 1935, a paleontologist named Ralph von Koenigswald was sorting through the bins of a traditional medicine shop in Hong Kong, where fossil teeth were sold as dragon bones to be ground into remedies, when he found a single molar. It was a primate tooth unmistakably, but the size was absurd. Far too large for any ape that science recognized. He bought it. From that one tooth and the handful that followed, von Koenigswald deduced the existence of the largest primate that has ever lived, Gigantopithecus blacki. To this day, after 90 years of searching the entire physical record of this creature, amounts to roughly 2,000 isolated teeth and 4 partial jawbones. Not a single complete skull, not one limb bone. And yet, from those fragments, scientists have assembled a portrait of something extraordinary, an ape that may have stood 3 meters tall and weighed more than 250 kilograms, a relative not of ourselves, but of the orangutan living in the forests of what is now southern China. That family connection is no longer a guess. In 2019, a team led by Frito Welker recovered ancient proteins from the enamel of a Gigantopithecus tooth, nearly 2 million years old, the oldest molecular evidence of its kind ever drawn from a fossil, and confirmed the giant as a deep cousin of today's orangutans. We can no longer hold its skull, but we have read fragments of its proteins, and they answer at least the question of what it was. For a long time, no one could say when it had died or why. Then in 2024, a team led by Yingqi Zhang of the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology in Beijing and Kira Westaway of Macquarie University published a study in the journal Nature. Using 6 independent dating methods across 22 cave sites, they fixed the extinction of Gigantopithecus to a window between roughly 295,000 and 215,000 years ago. The cause, they concluded, was its own magnificence. The wear on its teeth and the residues trapped against them point to an animal bound tightly to the fruit and fibrous plants of a closed, humid forest. As the climate grew more seasonal, and that forest thinned and broke into open grassland, the giant ape, too large and too specialized to change its diet, was left to starve in a landscape that no longer grew the only food it understood. The largest ape that ever lived brought down not by a rival, but by the size that had made it a wonder. But here is where the bones run out, and something far older takes their place. Something that lives in all of us. Across nearly every human culture on Earth, in places that never made contact with one another, we tell the same story. The Himalayas have the Yeti. The forests of the Pacific Northwest have Sasquatch. Australia has the Yowie. China itself has the Yeren the Wild Man. Central Asia has the Almas. The details shift, but the figure never does an enormous, hairy, upright creature larger than a man that haunts the wild places at the edge of human territory. The anthropologist Grover Krantz spent much of his career arguing that this universal myth was not invented, but remembered the fossil of a real encounter, and that the likeliest original was a surviving population of Gigantopithecus, or something descended from it. He went so far as to claim that the proportions reported in eyewitness sketches, the breadth of the shoulders, the inferred weight matched the very jaw he could hold in his own 2 hands. His colleagues judged the claim unprovable, and they were right to. But the instinct beneath it reaches towards something real. Honesty demands that we say plainly what the evidence supports. The 2024 dating places Gigantopithecus extinct long before modern humans ever reached its forests, which makes a direct memory passed down to us very hard to defend. And despite a century of expeditions, not one bone, not one body, not one verifiable trace of any living giant ape has ever surfaced. The creatures of the mountains remain stories. And yet, the question that lingers is not really whether a giant ape still hides in the bamboo. It is why we all dream the same dream. Why every branch of humanity scattered across every continent independently filled its darkest forests with the same towering hair-covered shape. For almost the entire span of our existence, we were not alone. We shared the planet with giants, with monsters, with other minds housed in other bodies. And one by one, we outlasted every one of them until we found ourselves standing at the top of an empty world, telling stories about the things that used to share it with us. Look closely at those stories. The dragon in the cave was a giant lizard. The bird that stole children was an eagle that broke the bones of Moa. The hairy giant at the edge of the map was the largest ape that ever lived. We did not invent our monsters. We remembered them. And the most haunting possibility of all is not that one of them might still be out there in the dark. It is that we have spent 10,000 years convincing ourselves the dark is finally empty, and we have never once been entirely sure. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.